Welcome to the Bonhoeffer Show with Bill Hull. The show about stuff most people try to avoid, but can't because it controls their lives. Religion, culture, and politics. Why does Bill Hull host this show? Because he and Bonhoeffer hoisted a few brews together in Berlin. Nope. That never happened. Is it that Bonhoeffer's book, The Cost of Discipleship, both challenged and changed Bill as a young man? Well, yes, that is part of it. But it's primarily because Bonhoeffer called us to a costly discipleship, and there has never been a time when such courage has been more absent or desperately needed than now. Bonhoeffer famously said, "Christianity without discipleship is always Christianity without Christ." The Bonhoeffer Project is committed to turning leaders into disciple makers. Because if leaders fail to create disciple-making movements, then we have failed. So, ladies and gentlemen, here he is. He's still tall and good-looking. And yes, he is wearing German cologne. He's acquired a few more underlying conditions. But direct from his underground bunker in Long Beach, California, the man who once told Don Henley, "You can check out anytime you want, but you can never leave," Bill Hull.
Thank you, Steve Simmons. Another fine introduction. The Man with the Golden Throat. There was a movie called The Man with the Golden Arm. Wasn't that a James Bond movie? I'm asking my guest host today. Yes, that was right. Okay. Today is kind of an unusual program, but a fun one. And that is what one writer reads. In other words, what are the books that I read in 2020 that are or were impactful, that I enjoyed, that I'd like to recommend to others. And then we are going to also find out a little bit about the reading habits of our guest host. One is Jim Thomas, Dr. Jim Thomas, pastor, a lead pastor of a church that actually was planted or started during the Civil War, or maybe even before that. And he's been there a very long time. And he has been the lead pastor ever since its inception, I guess. But Jim, welcome to the program. You're our guest, one of our guest hosts today.
Thanks, Bill. Good to see you and hear from you today.
And also we have Cindy Perkins, who is the executive director of the Bonhoeffer Project and a professor at Trinity University in Florida. Also, she is one of our cohort leaders and by far our best recruiter. So Cindy, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Bill. It's so good to be here. Can't wait to talk about books today.
Yeah, so here we go. Now, fundamentally, everything I do comes from writing. Hannah Arendt, who was a German philosopher who studied under Martin Heidegger and did her PhD with Karl Jaspers. You're supposed to say Jaspers. These were two of the great philosophers of the 20th century, particularly in Germany. And she is known best for her Eichmann in Jerusalem report on Adolf Eichmann's trial there. But she said it well when she said, "I write in order to think." And I find that that's true of me as well. I am able to work out my thoughts best by writing them down. Now, this is true of millions of people, whether you're making out a grocery list or you're finishing up your novel. You know, I wrote a novel, by the way. Not many people know about it, unfortunately. Maybe fortunately. I just wanted to write a novel to prove I could write a novel. I didn't ever claim it would have to be a good one, but it makes you laugh a lot, and it's fun. That's what I've been told. And it's sold in the hundreds. So there are hundreds of people in America who have read this novel, and their lives have been changed because of it, probably for the negative. But I started by falling in love with words and how sentences are put together. And this particularly did not happen to me until I was about 20 years old, and I became a Christian. And I realized when I started studying for the very first time in college, I was probably a junior in college before I started studying. Somehow I got through the previous part without studying much. But I really did find that school then became quite easy for me in many ways, and I had opinions. And so I would love to read and have these opinions develop in me, and I would read things over and over again. And so I began to read books that were not assigned to me, and to get a person to read something that is not assigned to them, or you're not being paid to read, is difficult, because the only reason you would read something beyond that is that it becomes valuable to you to read. So that's why I take such a great satisfaction from people having read my books, is because they didn't have to read them. At least in many cases, they didn't have to. So the creativity in me is constantly the way I get creative is I fill my brain with lots of ideas and lots of things that people say, whether I agree or disagree with them. That's the reason I like to read about philosophers and different kinds of theologians, people that don't agree with me, even politicians. So reading and writing and teaching and speaking for me, it all comes from the same place. That is the mind, and God told us to start there, because that's how our minds are changed, how our lives are changed and transformed, it starts in the mind, Romans 12, 1 and 2. And you cannot think clearly, and you, maybe some people don't think about this, but you can't really think clearly without language. And this is one of the reasons that God, I think, said Paul said in chapter 12 of Romans, be transformed by the renewing of your mind, because it's what your mind is, what you're thinking, what your worldview is, the why, and all of those kinds of things. So you have to read and you think and you write and you speak it. And even Helen Keller, if you're familiar with her story, she was both blind and deaf, but she needed a language before she could learn. And she learned several languages through Braille. Anything I've done as a leader or a pastor has been based in scripture and the wisdom of others regarding it about life itself. So I think in 2020, in terms of what I've learned in reading and writing and how it's infected me, I have written over 50 weekly columns in 2020. I produced 40 plus podcasts. I delivered many speeches, webinars, and lectures, most of them without leaving this chair that I'm seated in right now, because we all know why. And so below I will talk about some of my favorite books of 2020, but I first of all wanted to talk about books that I was not able to finish in not only 2020, but in many other years. So here are the books, and not many people talk about this, but I thought this would be interesting. The books I've tried to read more than once and I can't finish. War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. It's really long and it's really intricate, and there's an awful lot of Russian names. Like even in the first chapter, which is very long as I recall, and opens with this party, kind of dinner party, and the names, just trying to keep people straight, is just exhausting. So I kind of gave up on War and Peace. The movie is horrible, so it's not something you really would benefit from unless it's an assignment. The City of God by St. Augustine. I'd like to think that I'm that person who can just swimmingly go through the City of God and go, wow, all 1,200 pages. And boy, I was enthralled the entire time. I have not been able to finish it. I've read portions, but I just can't finish it. I need the, Cliff Notes would be great for War and Peace. Church Dogmatics by Karl Barth. Everybody, that's one of the ways you can sort of do one-upsmanship with people, is you can talk about, well, I read Church Dogmatics of volume 4. And there's like 8 or 9 volumes. They're just a volume on the volumes. Then there's Moby Dick with Herman Melville. As I remember, Gregory Peck in the movie, they went after the whale, and things got nasty. Dante's Inferno. Well, you know, after you get down toward the bottom, I think you actually exit and get out and it's better. But I've tried that too. And it's essentially this strange form of poetry that I just can't hang in there with. Modern Times by Paul Johnson. It's very thick, and I like Paul Johnson, but I just couldn't read all of it. Michael Palin's Diaries, 1969 to 1979. I like that one because Michael Palin probably would laugh, just knowing. And if you don't know who Michael Palin is, he's one of the founders of Monty Python. Calvin's Institutes by John Calvin. I know this is probably a great sin, but I have it right over here. I can't finish that thing. You know, it's just so long and the print so small and exhausting. The Odyssey by Homer. There you go. Can't finish it. And the last one I just put in for yucks, The Complete Works of Sigmund Freud. It's your mother. So that's basically the books that I can't. There's other books that I haven't been able to finish, like the complete book of lawnmower repair, but or even the complete book of discipleship, which by Bill Hall. All right, so I have two great guests today, and I've already given some preliminary introduction to them, but they're both big readers, and we're going to talk about some of their reading in just a moment. But let's first take a break and listen to how you can get involved in the Bonhoeffer Project. Because listen, if you want to bring order out of chaos, if you want to make your life make more sense, if you want to become a disciple maker, that's what you need to do. Get into one of our cohorts, because that is what we do. So let's take a break. Do whatever the guy tells you right now.
We turn leaders into disciple makers. That's the mission of the Bonhoeffer Project. But before we can turn you into a disciple-making leader, we need you to be in a cohort. A cohort is a 1-year, 10-meeting, book reading, pray, wrestling, writing, planning challenge that has the potential to change you and thus redirect your life. Interested? Here's the process. Go to our website, thebonhoefferproject.com, and complete the application form. We will contact you. We will then help you select the type of cohort that's best for you. In person, online, or online school, which is asynchronous, so it's not affected by time zones and anyone in the world can access it. Oh, and training is now also available in Spanish. In the meantime, subscribe to the show, read one of Bill's books, and send us a question you want Bill or some member of the Bonhoeffer team to answer. And now, back to the show.
Okay, we're going to start off with Cindy Perkins, our executive director. Cindy, Professor Perkins.
Yes.
What's been the best book you read this year and why?
Well, it's really hard to bring it down to one book because I read a book every other week. That's my goal for the year, is always to read 26 books a year. But I think there's really two that have. Can I have two, Bill?
Yes.
Okay. So first is Reclaiming Christianity by A.W. Tozer. The tagline on it is a call to authentic faith. And I think Tozer saw coming where we are as a church in America. And it was just, for me, just confirmation that, hey, we missed some stuff along the way. And he talked a lot about the remnant. He talked a lot about the authority, the relevant authority of God's word. And so I read a Tozer every so often. And so that one was a really excellent book. The other one that I read is Strengthening the Soul of Your Leadership by Ruth Haley Barton. And she talks about the fact that if we try to lead out of just our knowledge and not out of the soul piece of who we are, we mess up the people that we lead, and we mess up ourselves in the process. And so she goes back to every year I try to read a book on the spiritual disciplines and just get a little bit of a different take. And she goes back to that. And so it's just been an excellent work to read through and walk through. I go deep in these places. I'm like you, Bill. I read with a pen in my hand and make notes and think about who I might want to take through this book. And I've read some political books. Being a business professor, I've read a lot of business books this year, and there are some really good ones and there are some really bad ones. And let me just tell you, I have your novel.
Oh, thank you. Well, one of those hundreds that have got it. All right. You know, when you mentioned A.W. Tozer, everybody kind of knows the knowledge of the holy, but this particular book I don't remember, so I'll have to look at that. Is it a long book or a short book?
It's a medium. Let's go medium.
Oh, okay. Okay.
It's not terribly. None of his books are terribly long. The Attributes of God, I read that one this year as well, and he's got a part 1, part 2, and they're a little lengthy, but still excellent books. But he gives some real practical application for the church in reclaiming Christianity.
He was a Christian Missionary Alliance pastor in Chicago, and had a church of about 400, and he was there for many years. Yeah. And he died pretty early, like 62 or something like that, years of age. Mm-hmm. And I had members of my congregation years ago, Carl and Annette Bainey, who are now with God, but they were members of his church, and they told me what it was like to be a parishioner there. And it was one of the things that I remember is that they would have the names of all the members up on a big board in the lobby of the church, and how much money they actually gave each year.
Oh, so wow.
It was posted.
There's an idea.
There's some accountability there, right? So I read a story once. I read his biography because if I read an author a lot, I like to read their biography. But there was a story that said that they would be sitting at dinner with friends. His wife would invite people over, and the Spirit would speak to him, and he would get up, wouldn't even excuse himself, get up and go down to the basement to the boiler room, because that's where he prayed. They said he kept a piece of paper that he could put his face on the floor and not get rug burn on his nose so that he could pray. But he was just prone to random disappearances to go pray. So just an interesting character. But he had a lot to say to the church. I've probably read 20 of his books in my lifetime. And like I say, I try to read at least 1 or 2 a year. So.
How would you like to have followed him as a pastor, huh?
No, gosh, no. But people didn't really start reading his books and his works until after he passed. He didn't become a popular author until after he passed. So I feel like he might have been a prophet for our day. He understood. He saw coming what we're living right now.
So
his
you're
wife
ahead of the curve.
Probably really appreciated the royalties too.
Yeah.
Okay, JT. What about you?
You're ahead of the curve, Bill. You got people reading your books, and you're still here.
That's right. Yeah.
No, I had a Tozer moment a couple of years ago. I quoted him in a sermon, and a lady came up about a week or two later, and she showed me her baptism certificate, and he had signed it because she was a member of his church, and showed me his signature on her baptism certificate. I thought that was pretty cool. But
I have my ordination certificate up here. It says St. Christensen, whatever.
Oh, does it? Yeah.
Yeah.
You're doing good then.
Yeah.
You're doing
long
really
time
good.
ago. Yeah.
Well, my reading and writing story is not unlike yours, Bill. I don't know how I got through high school and 4 years of college without reading a book, but I did. And I could memorize 15 pages.
Where'd you go to college?
I went to Baylor University.
That explains why you were able to get through that.
Whatever. You stop it. But I just, other than some Hardy Boys books when I was a kid, I really just never got into reading. I was in sports and I was doing all this stuff. And I got to seminary and realized I needed to actually start learning some things. And yet I couldn't get that discipline going. And one day I found myself on the front porch of our little 1920s house that was renovated in 1923. And I found myself with a copy of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe in my hand. And I read the whole thing in a very short amount of time, and it kind of messed my life up. And so I read all of the Chronicles of Narnia after that. And so I went to the local bookstore when bookstores existed, and bought everything by C.S. Lewis I could find, and found myself in a deep hole really quick.
Mhm.
In fact, I think it took 5 years to read A.N. Wilson's biography on C.S. Lewis.
Oh yeah, I have
And
that book. Yeah.
do you have that book? Yeah, it's very detailed, and I didn't know what I was getting into, but I was determined. I called it the Eternal Book, not in its content, but in the time that it was going to take me to finish it. And I did finish it, and that helped propel me forward. But I found a deep love for reading as a result of those children's books, even as a 20-something-year-old. And since then, not unlike you, Bill, I have a stack of books that are half read, that I kind of go back to and then go away from, and that type of thing. But I think from 2020, I have to defer to Cindy and say there wasn't just one, because I try to read broadly as well. The one of the ones I read at the beginning of the year really spoke into our situation with COVID. It was a history book. Are y'all familiar with Eric Larson? He wrote Devil in the White City, In the Garden of Beasts, those books. But this one was called The Splendid and the Vile, and it was a saga of Churchill, his family, and their defiance during the Blitz. And basically, they were quarantined for the most part of the Blitz, every night after night after night of bombing. And to be able to walk through that and to see how they responded to that actually reminded me of the idea of how do we relate in a quarantine situation, and how are we going to come out of this? Are we going to get through this? And of course, the inspiration of his speeches and all those things. From a ministry standpoint, the book was written in 2015, but our ministry team read through a book called Canoeing the Mountains by Todd Bolsinger. I think Todd is at Fuller, maybe.
Yeah, he is. Yeah.
And he's taken the ideas of Heifetz and Linsky, who are professors at Harvard Business School, and adapted it to the church using the metaphor of the Lewis and Clark expedition. So it's all about adaptive leadership. And so he talks a lot about the difference between why people resist change when they're really resisting loss. He talks a lot about the idea of adapting and moving forward in leadership. He talks a lot about the mission trumping everything else going on in the life of the church, that we always have to point back to the mission, to the vision, to where we're headed. And so that's been really good, as we've had to practice adaptive leadership throughout 2020 as a staff, developing new plans, developing new rhythms, managing emotion of our people, and helping to lead them forward, and obviously what Bill has talked about before, the divide politically, the divide socially. We're in Atlanta, Georgia, and so we're in the Deep South. We have a lot of that going on right now, even in the midst of our congregation. And to be able to lead them forward in their walk with Christ, this was a helpful book. A newer book that I've really enjoyed is by Jonathan Pennington. It's called Jesus, the Great Philosopher. And what Pennington does is he said not only was Jesus Messiah, Savior, King, but he was one of the greatest philosophers in history. And he defines that as this, that the ancient philosophers talked about how to live in a certain way. They fostered a lifestyle. Now, it's fun because he said, in ancient philosophy, they would talk about how to live your life. In modern philosophy classes, they just talk about ancient philosophers, right? And so Jesus talks about the kingdom of God, and therefore has a philosophy of life, if you will, that speaks about him as the king. And so that's been great. And then at the beginning of the year, I read Becoming Dallas Willard by Gary Moon. And that biography was really impactful, since we do a lot with Dallas Willard in the Bonhoeffer Project, and a lot of his books we've read. So to read his life history, if you will. He was a Baylor graduate, by the way, as well.
Well, graduate school. We went there, got a master's degree. Yeah. Come on now.
Yeah. So, hey, I'm going to claim him.
He went to Tennessee Temple and then the University of Wisconsin. Yeah. So.
Yeah, and Baylor was between those.
That's right. Yeah.
It was between those. So, anyway, great book, great biography as well. So those are the ones that have impacted me this year.
Okay, I'm going to highlight a couple of three, and then we'll take a break. Well, I saw the movie Patton a few times, and then I read this book. It was 800 pages, and when you read an 800-page book, you just have to grit your way through some of it. But I did read it a little bit every night, and it took me a few weeks. And what I would say is it gave me a great appreciation for the generals who were part of our army during the whole 20th century, really, the first half in particular. But it gave you an insight into what goes on and how that whole society works, and how a flawed man, a privileged man, became a great leader. Yet he was so good at certain things and so bad at others. So he, without Eisenhower and without Bradley and without some of these other generals, they would have, who protected him and who tolerated him and worked with him, he would not have been able to have the legacy he has had. And one of the sidelights was that he had a, they made it sound like his voice was really high pitched. It was a little higher pitched than maybe normal, but it wasn't like that noticeable, frankly. I watched a few videos of actually him speaking, and it wasn't as bad as they made out in the book. But I really like that book. Killing Crazy Horse by Bill O'Reilly and Melvin Dugard. I've read all these books, these short histories by O'Reilly, and they've all been pretty good. And I thought this one, though, was where I learned the most, because I knew a little bit about all these other people, but I didn't really know much about the Indian Wars that went on for quite a long time in our country. I mean, I knew a little bit about it, of course, but I didn't know in depth what it was like. And so that gave me a great understanding and appreciation for what happened and why it happened. And there's some certain stereotypes about Native Americans and about the settlers and the mistreatment and the maltreatment. And there was a lot of bad stuff on both sides, but it was something that was very instructive and helpful. The best written book I read all year was by George Orwell. And I read, I've read several books by Orwell, Down and Out in London and Paris, and a few others. And one of the great lines from was him talking about, he went to a prep school. I don't think it was Eton, but it was, it could have been, but it was one of those very highbrow schools in London, in England. And he said that he forgot his languages, the classics, they would all study the classics. And he said he forgot his Latin and his Greek within 2 or 3 years, but he never took him a long time to forget how to be a snob, which he said that's what really stuck. That's what they taught the best, is how do you be a cultural snob. But he was a chain smoker. He died of lung cancer. And when he was hammering out 1984, that particular book, it was, I think as I call it, on the Isle of Man, where he was, and he was bleeding from the nostrils, as he smoked cigarettes, and he pounded this thing out to get this warning out that, and brought certain words to our culture like memory hole, Ministry of Information, and the propaganda and all those kinds of things which really we're facing right now in our country, which is very instructive. Okay, then I think we'll take a break, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about a couple of more, and then we'll be finished for today. So let's hear what Steve Simmons has to tell us about subscribing and some of the products and some of the opportunities. And we just want to remind you that the Bonhoeffer Project is now in Spanish. In fact, one thing with YouTube, you can watch any of our talks now in any language, anywhere you are in the world. I mean, you just check, if you want to hear Bill Hall speak in Arabic, boom, it's available to you. So all you guys hit Arabic, and it's all translated on the screen for you, from right to left even, maybe, who knows. And so let's take a break and we'll be back.
If you want to expand the disciple-making movement, then share the show with your friends and colleagues. Hey, it's easy to subscribe. Simply go to iTunes or to our website, thebonhoefferproject.com. Then click on The Bonhoeffer Show. Once you do, we will keep you updated with the Bonhoeffer Project's events, new materials and books, as well as the larger disciple-making movement current news. You can also access previous programs. And be sure to read Bill's weekly column, which is posted on the website. Remember, ask questions. Bill's answers are guaranteed to give you herd immunity, increase your IQ, and cause you to experience waves of euphoria. Well, not really, but his answers are really good. And now, let's get back to the Bonhoeffer Show.
As I said, the most eloquent book that I read in 2020 was Michael Walsh's The Devil's Pleasure Palace. This book is, Michael Walsh is a expert in opera and classical music, theater. He worked for Time magazine for a long time, the former magazine called Time. And this is the book. It's a great, if you love the arts, if you love the deep things of culture, he's your man. So it's a great education reading his book. And he also, essentially, the subtitle of the book is The Cult of Critical Theory and the Subversion of the West. He talks about the Frankfurt School. There's a couple of people that are most famous from the back in the 1930s that were of the progressive left at that time. Herbert Marcuse came to the University of California at San Diego, and he was probably the best known in the United States. But they fled Germany back in the 1930s. They came to first Columbia University, a group of scholars, and then they scattered throughout the United States over time. But critical theory essentially is everything is able to be deconstructed. I guess that would be the simplest way to say it. So you deconstruct everything, truth itself, and put it in what's called the dialectic, which is the give and take of discussion. And then you have what Hegel said, which is you have the thesis, and then you have the antithesis. And then the dialectic is the back and forth between the thesis and the antithesis, and therefore you get a synthesis. And so you advance truth by, you take A against B and you get C. And then you just keep doing that through history, and truth progresses. You know, that's kind of the idea of progressivism. And so it's based upon a pretty much of an evolutionary concept that you are evolving into a newer, higher, more enlightened being. And so as a result, the primitive things like belief, enchantments of like Christianity and a virgin birth, and the people, the Israelis and the Egyptians and the Adam and Eve and the Red Sea and all these stories in the Bible, all these enchanting ideas, well, they're not really relevant. And so we progress and we progress and we progress. And of course, Nietzsche was the person who said that the problem with breaking down everything is essentially you have to replace it with something. And that he didn't think that humans were able to replace the moral structures that Christianity provided for humans. And Nietzsche was right about that one thing, maybe two or three, but not many. So that's really what the book is talking about. I think it's worth reading. I read two books on race because this year, not only, it seems like we've done so much has happened this year, but race has been one of the big things that now people aren't talking so much about today. But I read Shelby Steele, who is an African American who was a and is at the Hoover Institute, which is a conservative think tank at Stanford University. And he wrote the book Shame, and essentially takes a contrarian view to what I would call the African American dominated grievance industry. And so I would recommend this book as an alternative to what maybe you standardly hear. Color of Compromise by Jason Tibby is this film series. I watched the film series. I read most of the book that went along with it. And in doing that, it really, I think, portrayed accurately the history of the church in America with respect to slavery and the problems of it. But the differences I would have with him is essentially he goes to what I would call the woke culture, and the idea that we have systemic racism, and systemic racism, in my opinion, is really just a matter of the heart now, because legislation has made institutional racism illegal. Now, how do you change something once the laws have established that these things are all illegal? Well, then it's a spiritual issue for the country. And so to me, I'm not saying that there aren't systems in place or traditions in place that would be racist. What I am saying, though, is that legislating it is not going to help now. What really has to help is the spirituality of people. But we can't get caught in this issue of the church needs to be awakened to our sin, and we need to confess it, and then somehow redress the issues, and it puts us in the same position as what's created the problems, which has created the black underclass. And what's created the black underclass is that they're still saying then white people, the power people, still need to give us more stuff, keep giving us stuff. And of course, what that creates is a subservient class. It just perpetuates the problem. And so that's my opinion. And that's what I think is the danger of it, even though I understand the motivation behind everything that people have done. I'm not saying that the people who have tried all these things have been misguided. I'm just simply saying, they did the best they could with the circumstances they had. But I think that we see now that it's really a matter of personal responsibility. And this is what Shelby Steele is trying to say. All right. Well, there were more books I read. Eichmann in Jerusalem by Hannah Arendt, The Club by Leo Damrosch, which was really fun. I mean, really a fun read, and amusing ourselves to death. But the last thing I want to bring Jim and Cindy in on is Future Church by Will Mancini and Corey Hartman. Will Mancini, I know, is a church consultant, lives in Houston, Texas. Corey Hartman, I can't recall where he's working and so on right now, but I know that both of you have read this book, and I've read this book. So what do you think? Let's start with you, Cindy. What do you think of Future Church?
I think Mancini did a really great job tapping into the space that we're missing. He has consulted with a lot of churches, looking at how they operate and where the problems lie. And he comes with the two premises of where do your activities lie? Where do the church's activities lie? Are you in the place of attraction in the lower room where you're just trying to get people in the door? Or are you in the upper room where you're taking people into that deep space? And because we've given our lives to discipleship in that place, we understand the power of the upper room and the necessity of that. And so I think he did an excellent job just identifying places where the church has come up short, leaving us in the position where we are right now as a nation, where the church could be really effective if we would choose to be. but we have chosen not to be because it takes time and energy and all those pieces. And his challenge to pastors and leaders within the church is just, for me, it's a striking place. He talks about the ways in his different laws that he looks at, the ways that we have defined and measured success. And our measurements have to change if we want to truly be a disciple-making entity in our society.
Okay, what do you think, Jim?
Yeah, we're reading this book as a pastoral team this year, and Canoeing the Mountains being about adaptive leadership. And I would put this in the realm of visionary leadership. How do you look forward? Obviously, Future Church would speak to that. The first thing I would say to anybody who's interested in this is don't let the subtitle throw you off if you're in the discipleship first tribe. You see 7 laws, that kind of, I push back against any book that's just 5 things to do this, 7 things to do this. And then kind of the trigger term, church growth. That had such a bad connotation in the 90s that it was all about programming and numbers and those type of things. Don't let that throw you off, because that's really not what this is about. This is really about what casting a vision for disciple making in a local congregation is really about. It's really what we do with the Bonhoeffer Project. Yeah, a lot of what Mancini does in this book is what we do with different language. And so I love the idea of not discounting, as Cindy and what Mancini calls the lower room, but to operate in the lower room, the numbers and the money and the programs and all that, based on the upper room, the bigger vision, the bigger plan, the end goal. And I think that he points us through these different laws in a way to reconsider all of those things and how to switch focus. And culture change is hard. We talk about that in the Bonhoeffer Project. Culture change in an established church, and I've been in, this church is 192 years old this year. I haven't been here the whole time, but that's a legacy church, and trying to turn that culture, even after I've been here almost 9 years now, is still difficult. And so to continue to walk that process and to break down the ideas that help move us toward the upper room that Mancini talks about, this is very helpful for that. So I would highly recommend it.
Well, I would highly recommend the book as well. I think that I like the idea of the upper room being purpose, mm-hmm. and the church's unique call in the culture, and the disciple-making vision, and then understanding that if you have a place to put that, and then understand that in the lower room you have place, personality, program, and people, the thing that most of us focus on historically. But one of the things that I thought that was really helpful is about input and output. Mm-hmm. And one of the things he said is, if you input certain things, there is no output on the other end. Mm-hmm. If they don't necessarily provide the output. In other words, what's your product? And the product is a disciple. Mm-hmm. And what is a disciple? Well, you have to identify it. And then knowing, here's what a disciple is, and here is what are the characteristics, and here's how you make one. Okay, so you're running the traditional church down below. You have a place that you're meeting. You have personalities who are leading it. You have a program where you're trying to implement stuff, and you got people issues. Okay, and so all those are real things that you're dealing with. At the same time, you got to keep in mind, what's the product? What is it we're in business for, so to speak? And keeping really clear on that. And then what difference does that make? So that's the reason I like the book, is because it tries to clarify these issues. And so for that reason, I think it's a really good read. And I'm thankful that whatever I can do to promote the book, it was the book on the church that I really liked the best this year.
And Bill, if I may, there seems to always be a natural drift back to the lower room, to the 4 Ps you just mentioned, mm-hmm. in ministry, if you're a leader.
Right.
Because that's where management happens. That's where you're doing things on the ground. And I think what Mancini does is remind us that the idea is everything that happens on the ground is dictated by that greater vision, by that greater purpose. And so as we all have that tendency to drift back toward management instead of leadership, this book helps us to really focus on leading people forward. And that's been helpful for me.
All right. Well, I want to thank Dr. Thomas and the most Reverend Cindy Perkins for doing a bang-up job of being guest host today. And so until next time, just follow Jesus and he'll teach you everything you'll ever need to know.
Well, we hope that the show wasn't too bad. Jane Hull wants everyone to know that if anything Bill said was offensive, she feels your pain. If you were upset by anything Bill and his guests said, well, mission accomplished. At the Bonhoeffer Show, we value irreverent, satirical, and generally inappropriate behavior. But when it comes to fulfilling the Great Commission, we don't mess around. Remember, subscribe. We promise. No private jets, no white suits, and definitely no toupees.